The last thing for us to talk about in this chapter is dimensionality. What we've been doing so far are what are called one-dimensional arrays, meaning they just go in one direction. So think of the pictures we've drawn before. Here you can look at the lower left, right? This is our vertical representation of an array that has a bunch of different elements in there. This is one-dimensional, right? It only goes one way. But it turns out we can have two-dimensional arrays and three-dimensional arrays, four-dimensional arrays, whatever you want. So over here we have a graphic to show how a 2D array looks, right? So instead of there just being this column, right, really we have this full table. We can go both right and down, right, instead of just down. There's a lot of data that has some sort of a table format to it. You can think, for example, the 2D array might be what you need if you want to store, for example, a game board, right? Picture you're playing checkers or tic-tac-toe, right? You want to have some sort of a grid setup, right? And that's what two-dimensional arrays can give you. Fundamentally, they're kind of the same idea. They're just a way, right, to store a bunch of things that are similar, right, but with kind of indices associated with them, right? So instead of just being, one index here, all of these will have two indices, right? So maybe this is, say this is 0, 0, right? 1, 1, and so on, right? All these things have two indices, but each slot, each compartment is going to store the same type of thing. The way you make multi-dimensional arrays in Java is simply to make an array of more arrays, right? So the picture we saw on the previous slide, this here, this 2D array, is really one array. Let's say this part here is an array, and then each element in that first array is actually a second array, right? A nested array, right? So this is an array of 6 other arrays. Together, that gives us a 2D array. The way we declare an extra dimension in Java is with an extra set of brackets. So over here, right, we have this now 2D array of scores. But notice the difference here is the extra brackets. So before, when we were creating an array, we simply wrote int bracket, and then we would have had scores equal new int bracket number, close bracket, then semicolon. But here, right, we have an extra pair of brackets. That extra pair of brackets represents that I have an integer array of arrays, right, or an array of integer arrays. So they're just nested inside of each other. If I wanted another dimension, I could add another bracket after that, right? So maybe I need a cube, right? Maybe I'm modeling something like a Rubik's Cube, right? That's what I would need to do. When I go to reference this stuff, it's going to be the same as with a 1D array, right? The difference, again, is just that bracket notation, right? So instead of having one pair of brackets around the 3, I need a second pair of brackets around the 6 to tell me about that other dimension, right? Where do I lie in the first dimension? Where do I lie in the second dimension? If I didn't have this, if I just had scores of 3, what that would be saying is, oh, go and look at the array of integers at index 3, right? So it would literally get me an entire row. But if I want to have just one element, then I need to have my second pair of brackets there that tell me the second index into that 2D array. So let's go ahead and write up a quick example of code that uses 2D arrays. Again, I'm going to be working off of one of the examples from the book, but instead of just giving it to you guys, I'm going to code the entire thing from scratch. So what we want to do in this program is print out a table, a 2D table of numbers that are counting up. So for example, my first row might look something like this. And so on, right? So right to left, they're always increasing by 1. And then what we'll do is we'll put 10 numbers on each line. Really, we should have a 0 over here. We're going to start at 0 as arrays do. So we'll have 10 numbers per row, and we'll just keep on going down, right? And so each time we'll increase in value. So let's take a look at how we would do this. The first thing we're going to do is create a new array. So what I'm going to have here is I'm going to have, again, my array declaration, right? So int bracket means build me an array of integers. But then I'm going to have a second set, right? Build me an array of arrays of integers. And I'll call this thing table, and then we'll initialize it. So let me make it out of new ints, and I'll make it have 5 columns and 10 rows, right? So we should print 50 values, 0 to 49. Let's compile this. Everything looks good. Now what we need to do, right, is populate it with information, or populate it with data. and then display it. Up top, right, the only thing we really did here was create the array data, or the array object, I should say. So let me jump down and start writing the code to populate this with information. So I'm going to go under populate data. If you think back to the previous times we've been using arrays, you'll remember that we've been using for loops to go and visit all the indices in that array. And we'll end up doing the same thing here. But since it's a 2D array, we'll actually end up with 2 loops instead of just 1. So what I'm going to have is I'm going to have a loop that looks first at the kind of first dimension, right? Which row are we on? And then looks at the second dimension. Which column are we on? So let's set that up. So first I'm going to go and I'm going to go for int row, right? First we said we're going to go up and down equals 0, right? So start at the first row. And then from there, I'm going to go row less than table.length. So if I do table.length, it's going to return me 5, right? So 5 is the size, right? The number of elements in that first array, right? Inside the outer array. Remember that the way the 2D arrays are structured in Java is arrays of arrays. So when we get the size of that variable for the 2D array, it's actually getting me that size of the first array. So it's going to return to me 5. It's not going to return 10. 10 is the length of the arrays inside of the main array. So this gets me to 5. That means that my row will go from 0 to 4, right? So I'll go and I'll see all those 5 rows in my table variable. Last thing I need to do is increment row by 1 so that I'm moving along each of them. Once I have that, I can go and create my second variable. Once I have that, I can go and create my second loop. So in here, I'll go column equals 0. So I'm going to have a second variable here, right, called column. This time it's going along this inner array, right? So I've gone first to the correct row. Now that I have a row, I want to go and look at each of the 10 columns inside of it. So over here, initially, I'm going to look at the 0th column, and then I'll go, well, column is less than table of row dot length, right? So whatever row I happen to be on, go and find out what is the length of that row, right? They should all end up being 10 in the end, but just for safety's sake or convenience sake, we'll go to that specific row in that table and get the length of it, right? So this is getting the length of the array inside. So it's getting this right over here, not that outer part. Once I have that, I can then increment ++, and so now I have the second loop that's going from 0 to the number of columns in the particular row that I'm looking at. Once I have that, I need to actually fill in the data inside. So this is where I'll go. I'll go and I'll type table of row, right? So row is kind of the first part, right? That's the first level of arrayness, right? In this table object that I've created. First, I need to go to the correct row. Row goes from 0 to 5. Then I need to go to the column, right? So column goes from 0 to 10. So this, as it is giving me one of the cells, right, inside of my table, right? The one at the current row and the current column. Once I have that, I can actually set it equal to something. So I want it to count up. So what I'll do is I'll have it, well, first it should really be a column, right? So column will give me those numbers that go from 0 to 9, right? They're incrementing by 1 each time. So each column, right, essentially it's incrementing by 1 as I go from left to right. But then as I go from top to bottom, I want to actually increment by the size of, I want to actually increment by the number of columns. Really that'll end up being 10. So I can just type that in here. So what I'll end up with is this, row times 10 plus columns. So for each row I go down, the value increases by 10, right? So here I'm at the second row here, right? So this increases by 10. And then for each column, right, that I'm in, right, I'm looping along looking at each of these, I add 1 essentially, right? So I increment 1 each time I go this direction, and then 10 each time I go this direction, right, as I move down. If I do it that way, then I'll get this nice 0, 1, 2, 3, 10, 11, 12, 13, right? I'll get those increasing up by 1 as it moves downwards. So let's compile this really quick everything looks good. The last thing we need to do is actually display this array. So what I'm going to do is copy these two loops, right? These two loops, essentially they're going to be the same, right? We want to go through and we want to display all the different elements inside of that matrix, or I should say that table. Once I have that, I can go in and I can print out each of those cells, right? Because this code is already set up to visit everything inside of that matrix. Since this code is already set up to visit everything inside of that table. So let's go here, system.out.println of table at row at column. If I just do it like this, it'll end up printing all of these on their own line. That's not quite what I want, so this is what I'll do. I'll remove that there and instead add a tab afterwards. So I'll space out everything on each of the columns by one tab. Once I have that, I need to space out my rows. So for each row, once I'm done printing out all the columns in it, I'll do just a println of nothing, right? So this will move me down one line. Every column value separated by a tab. Once you finish printing out an entire row, right, every column in that row, then print out a blank line, then loop and go down to the next row and print on each column and repeat. So let's compile this, run it, and see what we get. So over here we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and it goes down, right? It increases by 10 here and it continues to increment up. So there we have it, our 2D arrays that we've populated with our two for loops.